The New York City night displayed its usual ballet of lights and shadows in the Upper East Side, a wealthy neighborhood where the dreams of some contrasted with the harsh reality of others. Emily, a girl of only 11 years old, walked with hesitant steps along the sidewalk of Fifth Avenue. Her small, frail body disappeared inside a worn-out coat, several times larger than her size, inherited from some charitable soul from the shelter where she sometimes managed to sleep. If this story interests you, subscribe to the channel to receive all our exciting stories. Continuing, the cold December wind cut across her face, but she persisted in her mission. Between her trembling fingers were two pieces of paper, a carefully written note and an old photograph, both kept as treasures during the last few months since Mrs. Johnson, her only guardian, had passed away forever. It was she who, in her final moments, revealed to Emily the truth about her origins and gave her the photo she now carried. "Le Petit Bistrot," announced the elegant sign of the restaurant in front of her. Emily stopped, observing through the large glass windows the sophisticated environment that seemed to have come from another world. Her eyes, however, fixed on a specific figure, a man of about 45 years old, with graying hair at the temples, who was dining alone at a table near the window. Richard Anderson was his name. Emily had followed him for days, studying his routine, gathering courage for this moment. The successful real estate businessman was known for his coldness in business and for his solitary life, despite all the fortune he had accumulated over the years. "You can do it," she whispered to herself, pressing the papers against her chest. Her bare feet left damp marks on the immaculate floor of the restaurant when she entered, ignoring the disapproving looks from the staff. The maitre d' tried to intercept her, but she was quicker, sliding between the tables until she reached her destination. "Sir," her voice came out trembling, almost a whisper. Richard raised his eyes from his plate of risotto, an expression of annoyance crossing his well-groomed face. Emily extended the first note, her small hands visibly shaking. "If this story interests you, subscribe to the channel to receive all our exciting stories." Continuing, the businessman took the paper with evident irritation, ready to dismiss her with a few coins. His eyes ran over the simple request, "Sir, can you give me $100? He was about to pull out his wallet when he noticed the second line, 3 words that made his world stop spinning. "You are my father." The fork he was holding slipped from his fingers, producing a sharp tinkle as it hit the fine china. His expression transformed completely, his face losing all color. The years seemed to rewind in his mind, taking him back to a time he had desperately tried to forget. Sarah. The name he had not allowed himself to utter for so long surged into his consciousness like lightning. Her face, young and full of dreams, danced before his eyes. The secret romance with the maid in his parents' house, the whispered promises, the plans for a future together. And then the cowardice, the choice of the family empire instead of love, the money he had offered for her to disappear from his life. His eyes turned to Emily, really seeing her for the first time. The delicate nose, the large, expressive eyes, the way her chin jutted slightly forward. They were Sarah's unmistakable features, mixed with his own. The truth he had tried to bury for more than a decade was there, standing before him, dressed in rags. Emily felt her legs weaken. The hunger, fatigue, and emotion of the moment were too much for her debilitated body. Before Richard could react, she staggered, her eyes rolling back as her small body collapsed onto the restaurant floor. The elegant dining room plunged into a stunned silence, broken only by the frightened murmurs of the other patrons. A young waitress named Anna was the first to act, running to help the girl. As she touched her forehead, she felt the heat of fever. Looking for some identification, she found the photograph in the pocket of the coat. The image showed a younger Richard, smiling with a baby in his arms. A photo he didn't even remember existed, taken in a rare moment of courage before his cowardice prevailed. The commotion at Le Petit Bistrot attracted the attention of all present. Richard, still stunned by the revelation, watched the small unconscious figure being attended to by Anna, the waitress, who showed a gentleness that he himself couldn't express at that moment. His thoughts were a storm of memories and regrets. "Sir," said Anna, her voice firm, breaking the trance Richard was in. "She needs urgent medical attention. We've already called an ambulance, but I think you should accompany her considering—" She left the sentence hanging, her eyes indicating the photograph she still held in her hands. If this story interests you, subscribe to the channel to receive all our exciting stories. Continuing. Richard stood up mechanically, as if his body was acting on its own. The other patrons whispered, some filming the scene with their cell phones, others pretending not to see the drama unfolding. The maitre d', sensing the gravity of the situation, began to disperse the curious onlookers, protecting the privacy of the moment. "Sarah," murmured Richard, kneeling beside Emily, "what have I done?" His hands trembled as he lightly touched the girl's face, feeling the fever that consumed her. 12 years of absence weighed on his shoulders like a mountain of guilt. Anna, noticing the businessman's state of shock, took the initiative. "Mr. Anderson, I found this in her pocket," she said, handing him a small worn diary. The yellowed pages contained Sarah's delicate handwriting, telling a story that Richard never had the courage to hear. While they waited for the ambulance, he began to read. Each word was like a needle in his heart. Sarah had kept the photo and written those pages in the first years of Emily's life, planning to give them to her daughter when she was older. The diary revealed not only the love story between them, but also the daily struggle of a single mother who had refused to use the money he had offered to disappear. "She always knew who you were," explained Anna, who had briefly spoken with Emily before the confrontation. "Mrs. Johnson, who took care of her after her mother passed, kept all this and gave it to her a few months ago." Richard closed his eyes, remembering the last encounter with Sarah 12 years ago. She was pregnant, but he was more concerned with his own image, with the pressure from his traditional family, with his career plans. He offered money, a lot of money, for her to disappear from his life. "You can start over anywhere," he had said at the time, as if it were simple to erase a love and a life that was growing. The sound of the approaching ambulance cut through the night air. Richard watched the paramedics entering the restaurant, professional and efficient. Emily was placed on the stretcher, still unconscious, her small hand clutching the old coat as if it were her only protection in the world. "I'm going with her," declared Richard, his voice finding a firmness he didn't feel inside. Anna, who had become an involuntary witness to this family drama, nodded in approval. "Mr. Anderson," she called before he entered the ambulance, "there's something else you need to know. Emily has been living on the streets since Mrs. Johnson passed away. She's been looking for you for weeks, watching from afar, gathering courage. It's not just money she needs." The waitress's words hit Richard like a punch. His own daughter, had been on the streets while he dined in luxury restaurants and closed million-dollar deals. Guilt consumed him, but something else began to awaken in his chest. A fierce determination to do the right thing, even if belatedly. As the ambulance cut through the New York night, Richard held Emily's feverish hand, feeling the weight of every wrong decision he had made. In the pocket of his Italian suit jacket, Sarah's diary seemed to burn, holding truths he would need to face. The ambulance driver turned on the siren, and the sound echoed down Fifth Avenue like a wake-up call. The life of Richard Anderson, which he had so methodically built over the years, was about to change forever. Mount Sinai Hospital on the Upper East Side was a stark contrast to the reality Emily had known in recent months. The immaculate corridors and the smell of antiseptic created a surreal atmosphere. As Richard waited for news, sitting in an armchair in the pediatric ward's waiting area, his hands still held Sarah's diary, but he didn't have the courage to continue reading. "Mr. Anderson?" Dr. Jennifer Lee's soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Emily is responding well to treatment. She was quite debilitated, dehydrated, and had a respiratory infection, but she's stable now. What concerns me is the overall picture. There are clear signs of chronic malnutrition." Richard swallowed, hard each word from the doctor increasing his feeling of guilt. When can I see her?" "She woke up a little while ago and asked for you," replied the doctor, a slight tone of surprise in her voice. "Normally we don't allow visits outside of visiting hours, but given the circumstances, Just try not to agitate her too much." The businessman followed the silent corridors to room 507. He paused at the door, his heart beating out of rhythm. Emily was sitting on the bed, looking even smaller among the white hospital sheets. Her large eyes, so similar to Sarah's, fixed on him as soon as he entered. "Hi," she said, her voice small but firm. There was no accusation in her tone, just a cautious curiosity. "Hi, Emily," Richard replied, approaching slowly. He sat in the chair next to the bed, aware that his every movement was being closely observed by the girl. "How are you feeling?" "Better. The nurse said I can eat real food tomorrow." She paused, playing with the edge of the sheet. Did you read my mom's diary?" Richard shook his head. "Just a little. I didn't have the courage to continue." His hands tightened on the small notebook. "Emily, I'm sorry for everything." "Mrs. Johnson always said we shouldn't hold grudges," she replied, surprising him with her maturity. "She told me that my mom never spoke badly of you. She just said that sometimes people are afraid to do the right thing." The girl's simple words hit Richard hard. Sarah, even after everything he had done, hadn't turned him into a monster for their daughter. This posthumous generosity only increased his feeling of guilt and his determination to do things differently now. "You look a lot like her," he said, his voice choked. "You have the same way of looking at people as if you could see inside them." A small smile appeared on Emily's face. "Everyone says that, but Mrs. Johnson said I have your nose." She touched her own nose, such an innocent gesture that it brought tears to Richard's eyes. The silence that followed was no longer so heavy. It was Emily who broke it. "What's going to happen now?" Richard straightened in his chair. It was a question he had been asking himself since the moment he read that note in the restaurant. "Now," he said, gathering all the certainty he could find, "I'm going to do what I should have done 12 years ago. I'm going to take care of you, Emily. If you give me that chance, can I keep my coat?" she asked, surprising him with the change of subject. "I know it's old, but of course you can," he replied quickly, realizing that the coat was more than just a piece of clothing. It was a connection to her previous life, to the people who had really taken care of her when he wasn't there. A nurse entered the room, carrying a tray with medications. "Time for medicine," she announced with a gentle smile. "And then, young lady, you need to rest." "Will you come back tomorrow?" Emily asked, a vulnerability in her voice that broke Richard's heart. "Yes, I will. I promise." And for the first time in his life, Richard Anderson made a promise he was determined to keep, no matter the cost. As he left the hospital, it was already past midnight. The city continued to pulse outside, indifferent to the transformation occurring inside that hospital room. Richard took out his cell phone and began making calls. There was much to be organized, many changes to be made. His penthouse in Tribeca would need to be adapted to receive a child. He would need help. He knew nothing about raising an 11-year-old girl. But before all that, there was something he needed to do. He sat on a bench in the square in front of the hospital and, gathering courage, opened Sarah's diary. It was time to face the truth he had run from for so long. The pages of Sarah's diary revealed a story of love and sacrifice that Richard had never allowed himself to know. Sitting on that park bench, her words transported him 12 years into the past. "Dear Emily, when you read these words, you may be old enough to understand that love sometimes comes in imperfect forms. Your father is not a bad man, just someone who was afraid to face his own truth. I keep this photo not to feed resentments, but so you know there was a moment when he held you with affection, when his eyes shone upon seeing you for the first time." Richard ran his fingers over the yellowed pages, recognizing moments he had buried in his memory. Sarah described in detail the months when they grew close, when she worked in his parents' mansion, the hidden encounters in the garden, the whispered promises, the dreams of a life together. It was all there, preserved in her delicate handwriting. "I now work 2 jobs to give you, my daughter, everything you deserve. The money your father offered remains untouched in the account he opened. Not out of pride, but because I want you to grow up knowing that your mother chose love over comfort. Maybe one day he'll understand that some things are priceless." The sound of an arriving ambulance brought him back to the present. The sky was already beginning to clear, announcing a new day. Richard closed the diary, carefully storing it in his suit jacket pocket. His cell phone vibrated. It was Jessica, his personal assistant, responding to the urgent messages he had sent during the night. "Everything is arranged, Mr. Anderson," she informed. "The interior designer will arrive at the penthouse at 8 a.m. to start the room adaptations. The social worker you asked to hire will be at the hospital at 10 a.m. to start the legal procedures. I've also cancelled all your meetings for this week." "Thank you, Jessica," he replied, noticing how different his voice sounded, softer. "I need one more favor. Find someone who can help me understand how to be a father to an 11-year-old girl." On the other end of the line, there was a moment of surprised silence. In 15 years working for Richard, Jessica had never heard him show so much vulnerability. "I can recommend Dr. Rachel Goldberg. She's a child psychologist and has experience in family readaptation cases." At 8 a.m. sharp, Richard was back at the hospital, this time wearing jeans and a casual shirt, clothes he didn't even remember he had. He found Emily awake with more color in her face, chatting animatedly with a nurse while having breakfast. "You really came back," she said, a shy smile lighting up her face. "A promise is a promise," he replied, sitting next to her. "How are you feeling?" "Better. Nurse Amy said my fever is gone." Emily paused, observing him with that perceptive look that so reminded him of Sarah. "You look different today." Richard laughed softly. "Yeah, I guess I do. Emily, there are some people who are going to help us to make this work. A social worker will come to talk to you later. Is that okay?" The girl nodded, but her look became worried. You're not going to send me to a shelter, are you?" "No," he replied quickly, taking her small hand in his. "No, Emily, I'm preparing my home for you. Actually, I hired an interior designer to set up your room. I thought maybe you could tell me what you like, your favorite colors, those kinds of things." Emily's eyes widened. "I'm going to have my own room?" The genuine surprise in her voice broke Richard's heart. "Yes, and you can decorate it however you want. But only if you want to, Emily. I won't force anything." "I like blue," she said after a moment. "And stars. Mrs. Johnson taught me several constellations. We used to look at the sky every night before bed." Richard made a mental note, already planning a starry ceiling for her room. "We can put a telescope on the balcony," he suggested, seeing her eyes light up at the idea. Dr. Lee entered the room, interrupting the conversation. "Good morning. I came to see how our patient is doing. Mr. Anderson, could you come with me for a moment? We need to discuss the next steps of the treatment." Before leaving, Richard hesitated. "I'll be right back, okay?" Emily nodded, picking up the TV remote that Amy had left for her. "I know," she replied simply, but there was confidence in her voice, a confidence he knew he would have to work hard to deserve. Richard's penthouse in Tribeca had never seemed so empty and yet so full of possibilities. As Olivia Ramirez, the interior designer, presented the projects for Emily's room, he found himself thinking about how that space, once so impersonal, would need to transform into a real home. "And here, Mr. Anderson, we can create a reading nook by the window," Olivia explained, showing the designs on her tablet, "with comfortable cushions and a small bookshelf. The ceiling will be very special, with a lighting system that simulates the night sky, allowing Emily to see the constellations that mean so much to her." Richard admired the projects, impressed by the professional's sensitivity in capturing the essence of what his daughter had mentioned at the hospital. It was then that the intercom rang. It was Jessica announcing the arrival of Dr. Rachel Goldberg, the child psychologist. "Good morning, Mr. Anderson," Dr. Goldberg greeted, a middle-aged woman with a welcoming smile and perceptive eyes. "I imagine you're anxious with all these changes." "Anxious is an understatement," Richard admitted, leading her to the living room. "I don't even know where to start. How do I help a child who's been through so much, who grew up without you?" she gently completed. "Mr. Anderson, the first step is to accept that we can't change the past. What matters now is building a future. Emily will need structure, consistency, and above all, patience, both yours and hers." The conversation with Dr. Goldberg was interrupted by the arrival of Elizabeth Anderson, Richard's mother. The elegant 70-year-old woman entered the apartment like a contained storm, her heels clicking firmly on the marble floor. "Richard, what's this story I'm hearing? A girl? A daughter?" Her voice trembled between indignation and disbelief. "Do you have any idea of the scandal this could cause? And right now with the company merger underway?" "Mom," Richard interrupted, his voice surprisingly firm. "This is Dr. Rachel Goldberg, a child psychologist who's helping us with the transition. And yes, Emily is my daughter, your granddaughter." Elizabeth paused, observing her son as if seeing him for the first time. In all her years of life, she had never seen him confront her in this way. "And that woman, Sarah?" "She's no longer with us," Richard replied, his voice lowering. "And Emily was left alone when the lady who took care of her also passed away. My daughter spent months on the streets, Mom. While I was living in this luxury apartment, she was out there, alone." The silence that followed was heavy. "Elizabeth." Anderson sat down slowly on the sofa, her posture still rigid, but something in her eyes had changed. "What is she like?" "Intelligent, strong, kind despite everything she's been through," Richard replied, an involuntary smile appearing on his face. "She has her mother's eyes, but they say she has my nose." Dr. Goldberg observed the interaction with professional interest. "Mrs. Anderson, your participation in this process will be very important. Emily will need a family, not just a father." Elizabeth adjusted herself on the sofa, her face a mask of contradictory emotions. Does she like dolls?" Actually, Olivia intervened, who had been discreetly in the background. "She likes stars. We're planning a room with an astronomy theme." "Stars?" Elizabeth seemed to consider the information. "Richard, do you remember that old telescope of your grandfather's? It must be stored somewhere in the country house. The German telescope?" Richard's eyes widened. "Mom, that's a family heirloom." "And Emily is family," Elizabeth replied, surprising everyone, including herself. "If she likes stars, she deserves to have an appropriate instrument to observe them." At that moment, Richard's cell phone rang. It was the hospital informing that Emily was ready to be discharged the next day. The news brought a mix of joy and apprehension to everyone in the room. "Mr. Anderson," said Dr. Goldberg, "now the real challenge begins. Emily will need to adapt to a new life, and you to being a father. You'll have to learn together." "And you won't be alone," Elizabeth added, her voice softer. "After all, it's not every day that you discover you have a granddaughter who likes astronomy." Richard looked around the room, at the interior designer with her star-filled projects, at the psychologist with her calm wisdom, at his mother who, despite everything, was choosing love over appearances. For the first time in a long time, he felt he was doing something truly right. "Jessica," he called through the intercom, "I need you to arrange one more thing. A school uniform. It's time for Emily to go back to school." The day of hospital. Discharge dawned sunny, as if the sky itself was celebrating the new beginning. Richard arrived early at the hospital, carrying a bag with new clothes for Emily, chosen with the help of Jessica, who had researched online about appropriate fashion for an 11-year-old girl. "I brought some clothes for you," he said, handing the bag to Emily, who was still wearing the hospital gown. "I hope you like them. If you don't, we can exchange them." Emily took the bag carefully, as if it was something precious. As she pulled out the first item, a simple but pretty blue dress, her eyes sparkled. "Can I really keep this?" "It's yours," Richard confirmed, feeling a lump in his throat. "There are more things in the bag. Do you want me to wait outside while you change?" 15 minutes later, Emily emerged from the bathroom transformed. The blue dress fit perfectly, and the new sneakers replaced her former bare feet. She had kept her old coat in the bag. Richard noticed that she didn't seem willing to abandon it, and he didn't insist on the matter. "Are you ready to see your new home?" he asked, while signing the last discharge papers. Emily nodded, but Richard noticed her hesitation. "What is it?" "It's just," she began, twisting the hem of the new dress between her fingers. "What if I don't know how to behave? I've never lived in a fancy place." Richard knelt down to be at her eye level. "Emily, You don't need to worry about that. The house needs to adapt to you, not the other way around. Besides, your grandmother is anxious to meet you." "My grandmother?" Emily's eyes widened. Does she know about me?" "She knows, and she's preparing a surprise for you." Richard smiled, thinking of the telescope that Elizabeth had spent the previous day recovering and polishing at the country house. The car ride to the apartment was silent, with Emily marveling at the city through the backseat window. When they arrived at the building, she was impressed by the size of the edifice. "We live up there," Richard explained, pointing to the penthouse. "But don't worry, there's an elevator." In the lobby, doorman Mike greeted them with a warm smile. "Welcome, Miss Emily." Emily returned the smile shyly, holding Richard's hand tightly as they entered the elevator. When the doors opened directly into the penthouse, she held her breath. Elizabeth was waiting for them in the living room, dressed more casually than usual, trying to appear less intimidating. Beside her on a table was the antique telescope, now gleaming. "Emily," said Elizabeth, her voice softer than Richard had ever heard, "welcome to the family." The girl looked from the telescope to her grandmother, her eyes shining with emotion. Is it for me?" "It was your great-grandfather's," Elizabeth explained. "He also loved the stars. I thought you should have it now." Emily approached the instrument reverently, gently touching the polished metal. "Mrs. Johnson used to say that stars are windows to heaven," she murmured. "Your mother also liked astronomy," Elizabeth revealed, surprising Richard. "I used to see her sometimes in the garden, looking at the sky while she worked." Richard realized that his mother was making a genuine effort to build bridges, to repair the mistakes of the past, not just his, but hers too. "Do you want to see your room?" he asked Emily, who was still admiring the telescope. The room that Olivia had prepared was a dream come true. The ceiling was covered with an LED system that reproduced real constellations. A cozy reading nook had been set up by the window, with shelves full of books on astronomy and science. The bed was covered with a blue comforter with silver details that resembled shooting stars. It's perfect," whispered Emily, slowly, turning to absorb every detail. It was then that she saw, carefully folded over an armchair, her old coat, now clean and lovingly mended, but still recognizable. "I thought you'd like to keep it," Richard explained. "Some things are too important to leave behind." Emily ran to him and for the first time hugged him. Richard felt tears come to his eyes as he embraced his daughter. Elizabeth, observing from the door, discreetly wiped her own eyes. "Now," said Richard when they finally separated, "how about we order a pizza to celebrate? You can choose the flavor. Can I really?" Emily's smile lit up her whole face. "I've never been able to choose before." "Well, now you can," Elizabeth affirmed, entering the room. "And afterwards, if the sky is clear, we can inaugurate your telescope on the balcony." That night, as they observed the stars together, father, daughter, and grandmother, Richard realized that his life, once so empty of real meaning, was finally starting to make sense. Dalton School was one of the most prestigious educational institutions in New York, with its historic buildings and impeccable uniforms. Emily, standing in front of the main gate on her first day of school, gripped the strap of her new backpack, so tightly that her knuckles were white. "It's going to be all right," Richard assured, noticing his daughter's nervousness. "Principal Simmons will accompany you to your classroom. And remember, if you need anything, just ask them to call me." "What if the other kids ask about before?" Emily's voice was barely a whisper. Richard knelt in front of her, ignoring the curious glances from other parents. "Emily, you're so much more than your past. Didn't Dr. Goldberg say that each day is a new story to tell?" A small smile appeared on the girl's face. In the past week, the sessions with the psychologist had become a safe harbor for her. "She also said that I'm strong." "And you are," Richard confirmed. "Besides, you know more about constellations than anyone here. I'm sure that will impress the science teacher." Principal Simmons approached with a welcoming smile. "Good morning. Emily, ready to meet your new class?" Emily took a deep breath and nodded. Before following the principal, she quickly hugged Richard. "See you later, Dad." That word, Dad, still made Richard's heart skip a beat. It was the first time Emily had called him that in public. Back at the office, Richard had difficulty concentrating on meetings. His cell phone was always at hand, waiting for a possible call from the school. Jessica, noticing his restlessness, reorganized his entire schedule so he could leave earlier. "Mr. Anderson," she called during lunch, "the report from the social worker about regularizing Emily's guardianship has arrived." Richard leafed through the document, anxious. The process was going well, but there were still details to resolve. That's when his cell phone rang. It was the school number. "Mr. Anderson?" Principal Simmons' voice sounded concerned. "We had a situation with Emily. She's fine, but..." 15 minutes later, Richard was entering the school's administration office. Emily was sitting in a chair looking at the floor, while another girl her age sat on the other side of the room with a sullen expression. "What happened?" he asked, sitting next to his daughter. "Sophia made an inappropriate comment about Emily's family situation," Principal Simmons explained diplomatically. Emily responded with a rather eloquent speech about different family constellations. "She said I didn't have a real family," Emily murmured. "So I explained that stars also form different families, like the Pleiades, which are 7 sisters, or Orion's belt, which are 3 stars that seem separate but are actually connected." Richard felt a mix of pride and pain. His daughter had transformed a moment of potential conflict into a lesson about acceptance, using her passion for astronomy. "Emily," Sophia called timidly, "I'm sorry. I didn't know stars could have different families." A small smile appeared on Emily's face. "If you want, I can show you more about it with my great-grandfather's telescope." The tension in the room visibly decreased. Principal Simmons smiled, clearly impressed with the girl's maturity. "Mr. Anderson," she said, "Emily demonstrated today not only resilience, but also a remarkable ability to transform a conflict into a learning opportunity. I think we have a future astronomer on our hands." On the way home, Emily was thoughtful. "Dad," she began, "can we invite Sophia to see the stars sometime? I think she's a bit lonely too. Her parents travel a lot." Richard looked at his daughter, in the rearview mirror, amazed at her capacity to forgive and welcome. "Of course we can. We can organize a stargazing night. How about inviting your grandmother too?" "I think Grandma will like that," Emily smiled. "She said she wants to learn the names of the constellations too." That night during dinner, Elizabeth noticed something different about Emily. "How was your first day, dear?" "It was different," she replied, playing with the food on her plate. "But I think I made a friend." Even if she started out being a bit mean, Elizabeth exchanged a significant look with Richard. "You know," she began, "sometimes people are like distant stars. We need a special telescope to see their true light." Emily smiled, understanding the metaphor. "Like great-grandpa's telescope?" "Exactly," Elizabeth confirmed. "And you, my dear, seem to have a natural gift for seeing the best in people." Richard observed the interaction between his mother and his daughter, realizing how both had grown in this new family dynamic. Emily was learning to navigate her new world, and they were learning from her. The conference room of Anderson Real Estate was packed. Executives in suits and ties occupied every available chair, all eyes fixed on Richard as he presented the numbers for the last quarter. The merger with the Portuguese group Oliveira and Santos was close to being concluded, but there was a tension in the air that went beyond business. "As you can see, gentlemen," Richard continued, "the indicators are positive. However," the door to the room opened, and Jessica entered discreetly, making urgent signals. Richard felt his cell phone vibrate in his pocket. It was the school number. His heart raced. "Excuse me, I'll need a moment," he said, surprising everyone with the interruption. In the next room, Jessica was waiting for him with a concerned expression. "Mr. Anderson, Emily fell ill during physical education class. The school nurse said it's nothing serious, but..." "Cancel the meeting," Richard decided immediately. "But sir, the Portuguese..." "Reschedule for tomorrow. My daughter needs me." 20 minutes later, Richard arrived at the school. He found Emily in the infirmary, pale but conscious, with Sophia sitting by her side. "What happened?" he asked, worried. "She fainted during warm-up," explained the nurse, "probably from not eating properly at breakfast." Emily lowered her eyes, embarrassed. I'm sorry, Dad, it's just that I was nervous about the science presentation. She was going to talk about nebulae, Sophia interjected, defensive. It was so cool. She even brought photos she took with the telescope. Richard sat down next to his daughter. Why were you nervous? You know everything about this subject. It's just... Emily hesitated. Some boys laughed when I said I wanted to be an astronomer. They said it's for crazy people. Emily Anderson, Elizabeth's voice sounded from the infirmary door. The grandmother had been contacted by the school and arrived almost at the same time as Richard. Since when does an Anderson care what others think? Emily and Sophia exchanged surprised looks. It was the first time they had seen the elegant lady show so much emotion. Grandma, your mother also faced people who tried to belittle her, Elizabeth continued, surprising everyone with the mention of Sarah. And do you know what she did? She held her head high and moved forward. It was one of the things I admired about her. Richard looked at his mother, realizing how much she had changed in recent months. The mention of Sarah, made with respect and even admiration, was unthinkable a few weeks ago. Mrs. Anderson, Sophia called timidly, do you want to see the photos Emily took? They're very beautiful. Elizabeth sat down with the girls while Emily enthusiastically showed the images captured with her great-grandfather's telescope. Richard was observing the scene when his cell phone vibrated again. It was Fernando Oliveira, the Portuguese businessman. Anderson, where are you? We have millions at stake here. Richard looked at his daughter, now smiling as she explained to her grandmother about different types of nebulae. Fernando, I'll be direct. We'll need to reschedule. I'm at my daughter's school. Daughter? What daughter? I didn't know you had... It's a long story, Richard interrupted. And it's exactly because of this story that we need to review some clauses of the merger contract. What do you mean? I want to include a scholarship program in astronomy for underprivileged children, Richard explained, surprising himself with the idea he had just had. And a public observatory on the roof of the new development. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Anderson, are you telling me you want to modify a billion-dollar merger contract to include an observatory? Exactly, Richard confirmed, his voice firm. Some things are more important than money, Fernando. I learned that recently. When he hung up the phone, he found 3 pairs of eyes observing him, Emily, Sophia, and Elizabeth. Dad, Emily began, you don't have to do this. Yes, I do, he smiled, because you taught me that the stars are for everyone, not just for those who can buy an antique German telescope. Richard, Elizabeth interjected, the board won't like this at all. Then maybe it's time for some changes on the board too, he replied, surprising his mother. After all, as you said yourself, since when does an Anderson care what others think? Emily got up from the cot, still a bit pale but with a radiant smile. Can we stop at the cafeteria before going home? I think I need to eat something. Of course, Richard replied. Sophia, do you want to come with us? We can drop you off at home afterwards. As they left the school, Richard realized he had made another decision that would change his life. And this time it was a decision he was completely proud of. The extraordinary board meeting of Anderson Real Estate had the air of a tribunal. In the large mahogany and glass room on the 20th floor, Richard faced stern looks from the older board members, including his uncle Edward, who presided over the session with visible displeasure. Let me see if I understand, Richard, Edward began, his voice laden with irony. You not only want to modify the merger agreement to include social projects, but you also intend to restructure the entire investment policy of the company? Exactly, Richard replied, keeping calm. The public observatory will be just the beginning. I intend to create a foundation dedicated to education and science. And all this because of a girl who appeared out of nowhere. Edward's voice rose. A supposed daughter that no one knew about until a few months ago? Richard felt his blood boil, but maintained his composure. Emily is not a supposed daughter, Uncle. She is my daughter, your great-niece, and a legitimate heir to part of this company. And yes, it was through her that I realized our responsibility goes beyond shareholder profit. At the back of the room, Elizabeth observed the confrontation in silence. As the majority shareholder, her vote would be decisive. Richard, intervened George Santos, representative of the Portuguese group. I understand your belated paternal enthusiasm, but this can seriously compromise the value of the shares. On the contrary, Richard replied, standing up to distribute some folders. These are case studies of companies that have implemented similar programs. The return in terms of image and social engagement exceeded the investment in all cases. The discussion extended for hours. Outside the room, Jessica anxiously waited, holding two important calls. Emily's school, where her presentation on nebulae had been rescheduled for that afternoon, and Dr. Goldberg, who had urgent information about the guardianship process. When the tension in the room seemed about to explode, Elizabeth finally stood up. Gentlemen, her authoritative voice silenced everyone. As the majority shareholder, I have something to say. Richard held his breath. Despite the rapprochement of recent months, his mother was still an unknown when it came to family business. 30 years ago, Elizabeth began, my husband made a similar decision. He wanted to create an educational foundation. The board, at the time presided over by my brother-in-law Edward, voted against it. Do you know what happened afterwards? Our competitors did exactly that, and today they are a reference in social responsibility. The room remained in absolute silence as Elizabeth walked to stand beside her son. Richard is not just suggesting a social project, she continued. He's proposing a paradigm shift, and as his mother and president of the Shareholders' Council, I fully support his proposal. Edward stood up, red with anger. Elizabeth, you can't. Yes, I can, Edward, she cut him off. And more, I propose that Richard assume the presidency of the board. It's time for new blood to lead this company. The confusion that followed was interrupted by Jessica, who rushed into the room. Mr. Anderson, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's urgent. Dr. Goldberg is on the phone. She found something in the guardianship process about Sarah. Richard felt his heart stop. What did she find? A letter, Jessica replied, written by Sarah shortly before passing away. It was with the process documents, but it was only located now. The room plunged into a dense silence. Elizabeth approached her son, placing a hand on his shoulder. Go, she said. I'll take care of things here. On the way to Dr. Goldberg's office, Richard received a message from Emily. Dad, presentation postponed to tomorrow. Sophia is helping me make the slides cooler. Grandma said she's coming to watch too. An involuntary smile appeared on his face, despite the anxiety about the letter. In a few months, his life had completely transformed. The company that was once his only focus now seemed just a part of something much bigger. Arriving at the office, he found Dr. Goldberg waiting with a yellowed envelope in her hands. Richard, she said gently, I think you need to read this. Sarah left specific instructions about when this letter should be delivered. With trembling hands, Richard took the envelope. The words written on the front made his eyes water. To be opened when Richard finds his light in the stars. The auditorium of Dalton School was packed for the science project presentations. In the front row, Elizabeth discreetly adjusted a silk scarf, trying to disguise her emotion. Beside her, Sophia held a poster decorated with glittering stars. Richard, however, had not yet arrived. In her office, Dr. Goldberg silently observed as Richard carefully opened the yellowed envelope. Sarah's letter, written in her delicate handwriting, began simply, Dear Richard, if you're reading this letter, it means you finally found our Emily, or rather, she has found you. And more importantly, you've chosen to stay. You've chosen to be a father. You've chosen to love. Richard had to pause, his hands trembling. Dr. Goldberg silently offered a glass of water. I'm not writing this letter with resentment or accusations. I'm writing because I know that when this moment came, you would be full of doubts and guilt. But I don't want that for you, Richard. The past is like a distant star. Its light still reaches us, but we can't change it. Emily was born on a starry night. When I first held her in my arms, I saw in her eyes the same sparkle I saw in the sky every night. I decided then that, even if you weren't present, she would never be alone. The stars would be her company, as they were my company on lonely nights in your family's garden. Your mother, Elizabeth, saw me many times observing the sky while I worked. One night, she asked me what I was looking for up there. I replied that I was looking for hope. She didn't say anything, but the next day there was an astronomy book in my room. I never knew if it was she who left it. Richard looked at his watch. Emily's presentation would start in 30 minutes, but he couldn't stop reading. If Emily is with you now, I know she must have already shown you how special she is. Our daughter has a gift, Richard, not just for seeing the stars, but for seeing the best in people. It's something that neither you nor I taught her. Perhaps it's a gift from the universe. Don't blame yourself for not being present before. The important thing is that you are now. And I know you well enough to know that when you decide to do something, you do it with all your heart. There's something else I need to tell you. When I learned that my departure was near, I sought out Mrs. Johnson. She promised to take care of Emily and, more importantly, promised to keep these memories until the right moment. If Emily has found you, it's because it was meant to happen. The money you offered years ago is still untouched in the account you opened. I didn't use it because I wanted Emily to have a choice, not just financially, but the choice to know her whole story. Now this money can have a greater purpose, fulfilling her dream of studying the stars. Richard, you've always been good at building things. Buildings, companies, fortune. Now it's time to build something different, a family. And just like the constellations in the sky, each star has its fundamental role. With love, Sarah P.S. Tell your mother that yes, it was her book that sparked my passion for astronomy, and that this passion now lives in Emily. Richard stood up abruptly. I need to go, he said to Dr. Goldberg. My daughter is going to give a presentation about nebulae. Are you all right? She asked, concerned. Better than ever, he replied, carefully tucking away the letter. He arrived at the auditorium just as Emily was going up on stage. She saw him enter and her face lit up. Richard sat down next to his mother, who noticed his teary eyes. The book, he whispered. It really was you who left it for her. Elizabeth just smiled, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. Emily began her presentation with confidence. Nebulae are clouds of cosmic gas and dust where new stars are born. Some people call them stellar nurseries, but I see them as families, places where different stars come together to create something new and beautiful. The images she projected, taken with her great-grandfather's telescope, were breathtaking. But more impressive was the way she explained each detail, transforming complex concepts into stories that everyone could understand. And the most incredible part, she concluded, is that the light from these nebulae took years to reach us. So when we look at them, we're literally looking at the past. But this ancient light helps us build the future. The audience erupted in applause. Sophia jumped from her chair, waving her poster. Elizabeth discreetly dabbed at her eyes with the silk scarf. And Richard finally understood what Sarah meant in her letter. Later that night, the family was gathered on the penthouse balcony. The new public observatory was still just a blueprint on the drawing board, but great-grandfather's telescope remained faithfully at its post. Emily adjusted the focus, patiently explaining to Sophia and Elizabeth how to identify different types of stars. Dad, she called, come see, we can see the Orion Nebula today. Richard approached the telescope, but before looking through it, he hugged his daughter. Do you know, he said, your mother was right. You really do have a gift for seeing the light in people. Emily smiled, that smile that illuminated everything around her. And you have a gift for building things, Dad. Only now, you build different things. Elizabeth observed the scene with a serene smile. The astronomy book she had given to Sarah so many years ago was in her hands. She had found it at the bottom of a drawer and intended to give it to Emily. As the night progressed and the stars shone over the city, that unlikely family, built, with losses, encounters, courage, and love, continued its journey. Because, as Emily had said in her presentation, sometimes you need to look at the past to build a brighter future. And there, under the starry sky of New York, the future had never seemed so bright.